right, so on Thursday, we talked about the differences between democracy and communism. So we've already talked about this slide. We're going to talk about this slide in class tomorrow, and so then we're on to post-war Europe. So Stalin and Truman disagreed with how post-war Europe should be governed, all of that good stuff. Stalin wanted to keep Germany weak and divided and personally control Eastern Europe. At Yalta, Stalin had promised to set up free elections in Eastern Europe after the war, but not surprisingly, he lied about that. So those countries became what is known as Soviet satellites or the USSR satellites. Think of them as little moons that are revolving around Stalin. That was kind of the idea, that they didn't have their own decisions to make because he was making those for them. So that I don't want us to confuse that though with the real satellite Sputnik that is going to be released a little bit later in the 50s. The UK and the US wanted a united Germany and a free Eastern Europe, so we wanted democracy and for the countries to make their own decisions about what kind of government they would have. After the war, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and East Germany were all Soviet satellites or USSR satellites. So they were all countries that had decided that they were going to follow specifically Stalin and do what he said, but they didn't make this decision freely. Most of them were very poor after all of the war with Hitler and the Nazis, the death camps, etc. They didn't really have the power or money to fight back against a strong, large country like the Soviet Union. After the Potsdam Conference in the US, after the Potsdam Conference, the US and the USSR became embroiled in a 46-year-long Cold War with a few hot wars along the way. So technically, we don't say that the Cold War ended until 1991. That's when the Soviet Union officially collapses and it becomes Russia again. We talked last chapter about how Germany was divided into 4 parts between the US, the UK, the USSR, and France. But then the capital was also divided, and this is a picture of that right here. So you have Berlin. This is all Berlin. You've got Berlin here, and that's also divided in half. Because people in Berlin were suffering without goods, because remember, we have half of Berlin, we couldn't just drive there because the Soviet Union had a blockade set up here that wouldn't allow us to get our goods to the people who needed them in the western part of Berlin. So what we did is something called the Berlin Airlift, where we flew our goods from these different zones over to Berlin and dropped off the goods there on the western side, because Berlin itself is split in half. Well, this is how the country is divided. We also dropped off candy and chocolate. I don't know if you guys know who Emma Galligan is, but she was actually in Germany last year, and her host parents said that they remembered when the Americans dropped off chocolate and bubble gum in the Berlin Airlift, and that was the first time they had ever tried bubble gum. So that's kind of a fun story. But we also dropped off other necessary supplies like medical supplies, bread, things like that. Okay, and then this is our last slide, the Iron Curtain. So that's a term that you'll need to know. Churchill actually coined the phrase the Iron Curtain when he said an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. And what that Iron Curtain was supposed to represent was the divide between the communist countries and the democratic countries. So if you look at this picture up here in the top corner, You see this thick white line that's dividing more or less the blue countries from the red countries. You have Yugoslavia on this side, but they end up breaking off a little bit earlier. But when you look at this, you can see that this side obviously is the NATO side, the side that's on the side of America, and this side is the Soviet side, or the countries that were in the Warsaw Pact. So these are all the communist countries. These are terms that you'll need to know. So all 4 of these terms are terms that'll be on the test. The domino effect is the fear that communism would spread to Asian countries and hurt the free market. More specifically, the idea was that if one country became communist, the countries around it would fall to communism too, much like dominoes fall, when they're next to each other. Containment was the idea that you would keep communism in its current borders without letting it spread outside. So you wouldn't go attack a country that was communist already. You would just not let that country spread to other countries. The Truman Doctrine was obviously an idea by President Truman, and that was the idea that you would aid countries that are struggling against communism with money so that they would see capitalism as better and not fall to communism. The Senate agreed after Truman asked to give $400 million to Greece and Turkey, who were both fighting communism in 1947. There's the Marshall Plan, and that was the idea that we would provide $13 billion in relief to Western Europe, which again, those are the blue countries here, get food, gas, money, etc., to rebuild houses and jumpstart the economy, again, to make capitalism look better than communism. And then last thing, the goal of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine was that it would keep Europe open for trade and build good relationships with the U.S., also so that those countries would continue to fight communism. So this is our last slide. I'd like you to write down at least 2 of the red countries and 2 of the blue countries. For me, I think it's pretty easy to remember the United Kingdom and France. And then you could say, obviously Soviet Union is one of them, but I need 2 different ones. So you could say Poland or Romania. You could say Latvia, Lithuania. But there will be a question about which countries are NATO countries and which countries are Warsaw countries. So that's it for today, and thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow.